Did you know that champagne can only come from Champagne, France? And if there's a sparkling wine in the United States, it's not legally allowed to be called champagne. Did you know that's actually wrong? There are producers right now in the United States legally making sparkling wine and calling it champagne, but that's not legal for everyone to do. So in order to understand why some producers can make legal champagne in the United States and why others can't, and what all these different types of sparkling wine actually mean, we need to go back into the history. Today we're going to dive into a bit of the history of champagne, American sparkling wine, and open up some bottles to drink and taste ourselves. So grab a glass and join me on this journey into the history of American champagne. So to understand the history of bubbly wine, we have to go back to the late 17th century in Champagne, France, where champagne was invented. And the story of how champagne was officially invented is not completely clear. Sometimes Dom Perignon is credited with inventing champagne, but most experts agreed he probably didn't actually invent it. Nevertheless, it was the monks in France who invented champagne, and it wasn't on purpose. So they were bottling wine and they were putting it away to age inside the bottle. And we got to remember, in the Champagne region of France, this is in the more northern side of France, it gets a bit chilly. So these bottles were actually bottled before the fermentation process had stopped. And so during fermentation, the yeast are eating the sugar, but they hadn't completed it. And so they were stored away inside these bottles. And when it warmed up, the yeast woke up and they saw that there was some sugar there and they continued to eat it. The problem was, typically when this happens, it's in an open top vessel where the carbon dioxide can escape. But when it was happening inside the bottles, the carbon dioxide was trapped and it actually made the wine bubbly. And so when they opened it up, they were like, oh my gosh, this is actually amazing. And it became a popular style that is now all over the world. So the traditional champagne method, also sometimes called the traditional method. And this is a method that is used by bubbly winemakers all over the world even today. It's probably the most popular style of sparkling wine. But it's not the only style, and there's two other styles, the Charmat or Prosecco method that we're going to touch on in a little bit, and then also the Pét-nat style. And a lot of times when we talk about sparkling wine, champagne, because it's the most popular, people just assume it's the oldest, but that's actually not true. So there is a very old historical way of making sparkling wine called Pét-nat natural. And I've got an example here from field recordings of this style of wine. And this style of wine here is different from other styles of sparkling wine because it only undergoes one fermentation. So we just talked about the champagne style. The wine is made and then it is bottled and then it becomes sparkling. The Charmat method or tank method or Prosecco method, whatever you want to call it, is similar, except the wine is made and then it is put into a tank where it becomes sparkling. It's a closed tank and then it is quickly bottled to keep the sparkles, the bubbles in there. But Pét-nat, it only undergoes one fermentation. And so this is how people in caveman days would make sparkling wine. So they would start to make the wine, and then before the winemaking process is done, it is put into bottles to finish up the fermentation. And so there's just a little bit of fermentation at the end where the yeast then create bubbles inside the bottle. So one of the interesting things that you'll see about Pét-nat is that a lot of times there's sediment on the bottom of the bottle. And this sediment comes from the dead yeast that are in the bottom of the bottle. So with a traditional champagne method, even though the second fermentation takes place inside the bottles undergo a process called riddling, where basically they take it and slowly they turn it until the bottles are basically upside down and all of the yeast naturally falls into the neck of the bottle. This process takes a little bit. And then they quickly flash freeze the neck of the bottle. And so all of the sediment there gets trapped inside of this frozen block of ice. They then push it out, the carbon dioxide inside the bottle will naturally reject that block of ice, so there's no sediment inside the bottle. But of course, that doesn't happen with Pét-nat. And so the sediment in the bottle, bottom of the bottle, won't hurt you, but it's there. But let's open up this bottle of Pét-nat and give it a quick taste before we move on to the rest of the history of sparkling wine in America. And so Pét-nat oftentimes doesn't have a cork on it, because it just isn't quite as sparkling. And so this was interesting here. Sometimes they just have this like beer bottle style cap on it, but this one here also has a cork. This gets a good pop because of the carbon dioxide inside of here. So I'm gonna put a little bit in this flute, just because in a flute, sometimes you can see the bubbles better. But I'm actually going to drink it out of this regular wine glass here. So the first thing I notice here is that even before my nose gets close to the glass, it has such a yeasty smell, which makes sense because of the yeast in the bottom of the bottle. I'm getting a lot of like citrusy orange notes on the nose, as well as some maybe underripe strawberry, and that yeasty note, it smells like bread dough. If you've ever made sourdough bread before, that's what this smells like. So still getting that citrus, maybe a little bit of like grapefruit even on the palate. Also some underripe peach, like a white peach, some strawberry. There's a little bit of an herbal note here as well. And so the primary grape in this is Cabernet Franc, which tends to be a pretty herbal grape. And so that makes sense that there's a little bit of that like herbs or a little bit of a green note, not quite like grass, but like something you might pick in the garden. But one of the things about Pét-nat is the bubbles in it tend to be bigger. So you'll see with my flute here, first thing, the wine here is a bit cloudy. But then the second here is that there's not a lot of bubbles still rising up in the wine. And so one of the things that we'll see the difference here with the Brut Rosé from Peju is the bubbles will be a little bit finer. To me, it has more of like a beer or cider mouthfeel than a champagne, which isn't a bad thing. It does mean that the bubbles will disappear faster, so you have to drink a little bit faster and the bottle won't keep quite as long. But this is definitely delicious, and this goes for just about $25 on Field Recording's website. I actually picked this up in my local wine shop, so definitely something that's a little bit fun and different. One of the things I love about sparkling wine that's a little bit off the beaten path is that is America's sparkling wine story. So we briefly touched on what happened in Champagne, France, but now we have to jump ahead to the mid-1800s in Ohio. I bet you didn't see that one coming. So we're in Ohio, and there was a gentleman by the name of Nicholas Longsworth. And Nicholas Longsworth he was a politician, but he's most well known for basically being the founder of the champagne-style sparkling wine in America. So he was making sparkling wine with a hybrid grape called Catawba. And Catawba grows really well in the Midwest, but he was making it in a champagne style, and he was actually winning international awards with his sparkling wine. But he's not the only one. So sparkling wine started popping up all over New York and Pennsylvania, all over the Midwest. And in 1860, a winery called Pleasant Valley Wine Company was founded, and they're recognized as the first commercially successful sparkling winery in the United States. They also won international awards with their sparkling wine. But that's not where it stopped. All through this time, a lot of the sparkling wine that was being made in the United States was called champagne. So there were no laws at the time regulating what a wine could be called based off of where it was from. And so America and a lot of places all over the globe were producing wine, and they were calling it things like Chablis, like Burgundy, like Bordeaux, like Champagne, these places that we associate with regions because it's the regions in France today. But these wineries were just making this wine, and they felt like it was similar in style to what the consumer knew from these traditional regions. And so they were just calling them those. And it was a pretty wide practice. It wasn't great, though, for a number of reasons. One being, if the wine was kind of bad, then it gave the region in France a bad name. And so the wineries there didn't love it. But there wasn't much they could do about it because they didn't have jurisdiction over the law in another country like the United States, until Treaty of Versailles was signed. And in the Treaty of Versailles, it actually said that wine made outside of the region that actually held the name could not be called by that name. So Bordeaux could only come from the Bordeaux region of France, and Champagne could only come from Champagne, France. So that should have solved the problem, right? Except if you remember your high school history class, you may remember that the United States technically didn't ratify the Treaty of Versailles. And so some wineries in the United States continued to produce wine and called it Champagne, even though it wasn't from Champagne, France. It actually wasn't until 2006 that an agreement between the US and the EU was signed saying that the US could not continue to use these regional names for their wine, which 2006 was so recent in the grand scheme of wine things. But there was a little asterisk in this agreement that said any winery that had already been calling their sparkling wine Champagne could continue to do so. So it was a loophole, kind of. So there are some wineries in the US. I will say they're mostly cheaper, lower quality wineries that continue to use the name Champagne. That's why you'll see wine in your grocery store that says California Champagne on it. Most higher quality wineries that respect the craft of the French winemakers and respect the history won't call their wine Champagne, even if they were calling it that prior to 2006, and they'll just call it sparkling wine, and then the bottle will say traditional method, Champagne method, something like that to indicate that it's made in the same style. So someone who's looking for something that tastes like a champagne will pick up the bottle and know that they might enjoy it. But now sparkling wine, especially traditional method sparkling wine, is made all over the United States. And so I've tried sparkling wine from regions in the traditional Eastern or Midwest regions, but there's also a lot of great sparkling wine being made on the West Coast, particularly in California. And so the second bottle that I have here today is from Peju Winery, which is in Napa Valley. It's a really beautiful winery, so if you get the chance to visit, would definitely recommend that. This is their Brut Rosé, and so this is made in the traditional Champagne style. And this wine is made of the traditional Champagne grapes, plus a bonus grape. That is Pinot Noir, Chardonnay, and a grape called Pinot Meunier. But this bottle here also has some Pinot Gris in it, which is a French grape as well. But because it has mainly traditional Champagne grapes, unlike this Pét-nat here that was made of primarily Cab Franc, this one will have more traditional Champagne flavor as well. All right, so I'm going to pour this into this flute here, just because it's easier to see. And you'll initially see right off the bat, compared to with the Pét-nat, how many bubbles are in here. And then you'll be able to see the bubbles just rising up through there. So the wine is totally clear, unlike the Pét-nat. And there's a lot of little tiny bubbles rising up to the top. And I'm going to pour it into my glass here to try. So first smell here, this doesn't have that sourdough bread note. In most traditional champagnes or champagne style wines, you are going to get a little bit of the yeast on the palate, but it's not jumping out at me because there is no yeast left in this bottle here. Woo! I love the little bubbles. There's just something about that first sip of champagne with the little tiny bubbles dancing on your tongue that just makes me so happy. So this has strawberry, raspberry, those rosé flavors. It also has a little bit of toast from the yeast. That's that hint of bready note without being overwhelming. And this is just a very delicate sparkling wine. So quite different to the Pét-nat. Neither of these is better than the other. I actually like both, but this Pét-nat here does have more of a mouthfeel weight to it. The yeast will add some of that weight. It's a little bit on the funkier side, not in a bad way. Sometimes funky gets a bad rap. This one here is just fun and playful, while this one here just makes me want to be at a tea party. And so both definitely have their place, and both represent just the variety of sparkling wine that we get in American winemaking today. And American sparkling wine is more than just a knockoff of French champagne. There are a ton of different styles, winemaking techniques, grapes out there. Everything from hybrid grapes to Cabernet Franc to traditional champagne grapes. It is a world of sparkling wine. So be sure to get out there and try what's out there. Let me know in the comments if you have a favorite type of sparkling wine that you are enjoying. And if you're interested in learning more about the history of American winemaking and some of these fun styles throughout the United States, then be sure to subscribe and follow along this journey. Until next time, cheers!